Hi, everybody. Many thanks for asking me to give this talk today. It's always a pleasure to talk about some of the research that we're doing. My understanding is that I'm speaking to mostly veterinarians and that you are have come together to talk about housing. And so I've been asked to talk about dairy cattle welfare. I think I could spend a whole day on all aspects that it comes to impacting a cow's or calf's welfare when it comes to how we house and care for them. So I'm just going to highlight a few of the key areas today, and hopefully, whenever it is, I think it's in October, we can have a discussion about some of these things. So I wanted to start out with talking about some of the work on calves, and I've decided to do this sort of from a perspective of sort of a step-by-step approach to how should we care for calves, how should we feed them, and that care will also involve around how do we house them, since I my understanding is that it's a focus of this talk, of this conference for you. So to begin, I think what we need to do is what is standard practice or what has been standard practice and where are we moving towards and how do we actually change practice? So what do we do or what did we do? Unfortunately, in some parts of North America and the world, I would say that it's not what did we do, it's what are we doing. There are still many farms in North America and around the world where all calves are separated from their mother and then they're fed twice a day. Um, Hopefully, I'm going to assume that they all got colostrum and things like that. But they're fed using a bucket. And so they'll get 2 liters of milk dumped into the bucket. And then what you'll see, and I'm sure you've all been on farms like that, where the calves will stick their head into the bucket and go, and they'll drink that milk in about 45 seconds, and then they'll suck on whatever else they have. And our solution to that was to not think about the behavior that these animals were doing, but rather, well, let's just individually house them because then they won't suck on each other. When we do work in this area, one of the things that we always tell our students to do is to go back to the evolutionary literature and what would happen in a more naturalistic system. And what we know from calves that are suckle from their dams, that they nurse on average 10 times a day. Each of these nursing bouts lasts about 5 to 10 minutes, and on average, they'll drink about 10 liters of milk a day, which is like almost 2.5 times what we have traditionally been giving them. So because we're only feeding twice a day, and many farms do this, they must be hungry. But when we were starting to have these conversations in early 2000s, poor people did not believe us that these calves were hungry. They just thought this was normal. So what we do know is when we give these calves access to lots of milk in an artificial system, and believe it or not, we had to go to the veal industry to find buckets that were big enough to hold more milk. When we provide them access to a teat, calves spend on average 47 minutes a day drinking, and they drink more than 10 liters a day, which is exactly what they would do if they were on their mother. And they spread this milk consumption over 6 to 10 meals, which is very almost identical to what they would do if they were drinking from their mother. But how do we show people? Because in order to have conversations, we need scientific evidence. And so, limit feeding, which was the term that we use for when we're feeding calves only 4 liters of milk a day or 10% of body weight equivalent. So, obviously, for a Jersey calf, it's much less than for a Holstein calf. What is the evidence that we have that they're hungry? And so, the first evidence that dairy calves fed in this manner were hungry was one of our PhD students, Andrea de Paula Vieira, who was a veterinarian from Brazil. And we published this in 2008. So this is almost 20 years ago. And I'm going to say, on one hand, it makes me sad because we're still having this conversation of trying to get people to feed calves more milk. And we had this automatic feeder, and she had 2 groups of calves. They were all housed within the same pen. Statistically, that's a powerful way to do that. And she had calves that could drink whenever they wanted to, so they could go in, and every time they entered the feeder, they got milk. And then she had calves that were, the computer was said was programmed so that they would only get a maximum of 4 liters a day. And they would get, I think it was either a liter or 2 liters per meal. It is almost 20 years ago. So, but anyways, one of the things she did is she looked at the minutes per day of occupied in the feeder. So she had a camera over top of that, and she measured how long each calf was in the pen, in the race for the automatic milk feeder. Intuitively, we would think calves that were fed ad libitum would be way more time in the feeder, but that's not what we found. What we found is that calves, on average, that could drink as much as they want, they only spent a little over 50 minutes a day in the feeder. But those calves that were restricted to 4 liters per day spent twice as much time in the feeder. And we argue in the paper that this is actually a sign of hunger because what they were doing is they were gambling. Because remember, the computer was programmed as to when they could get their liter of milk, but they can't tell time. So they continually go in and thinking, oh, is it my time yet? And Andrea actually has evidence of this. She went in and she looked at each of those visits and she tagged it as rewarded, meaning that the computer said, yes, you can have milk, or unrewarded, where the computer said, no, you can't have milk. And so you can see that those calves that were fed as much as they wanted, they only did a couple of visits where they went in and didn't drink anything. Those calves that were fed 4 liters a day, they got their 2 meals of 2 liters, and then they went back again and again and again and again, hoping that now was time for more milk. And so this was the very first evidence that we were actually feeding calves in ways that they were hungry. Khan did a postdoc with us, and in shortly around that time when we were really investigating feeding calves more milk. And this is actually work that he did just prior to coming to us. But a lot of his work was based, this entire study was based on work that we had published in the animal welfare program. And here were 2 groups of calves. These were individually housed. Half of the calves were fed 10% body weight, which is Holstein calves about 4 liters of milk when they were born. And the other calves were given twice that much, so 20% body weight. And so this is the milk intake. And of course, you feed calves more milk, they drink more milk. And then what he did is at about 4 weeks of age, those calves that were fed 20% of body weight over the course of 7 days, he dropped them down to 10% and then of body weight. But because they were drinking more right from the beginning, they were actually heavier. So 20% of the blue calves was more milk than the calves that were in the conventional treatment. And then at about day 44, over the course of the week up to day 52, he weaned them. So we call this a step-down feeding regime. What's interesting is this is the body weight gain. And as I said earlier, those calves that were given the step down or 20% of body weight equivalent of milk, they actually gained way more weight. And this, remember, they weaned at about day 50, 52, and this study went out to day 90, is that those calves that were given lots and lots of milk in the first 4 weeks were provided lots of milk, they actually gained way more weight than their restricted counterparts. The other point that I want to raise here with this particular slide is this calf age on the bottom here and body weight on the side, is that for the first couple weeks, we don't see too much deviation, but by sort of day 15 is when we start seeing these calves split. This is the starter intake, and one of the arguments by dairy farmers and the dairy industry is we can't feed a lot of milk because we want them to eat grain, because we need them to be eating lots of grain in order to wean them. Step down, 20% body weight, conventional 10% body weight. So this is sort of like 4 versus 8 liters a day. And what you can see is that if it was true that feeding low amounts of milk would increase starter intake, we should actually see lots of starter in these first 30 days of life by those calves that were only fed 10% of body weight equivalent of milk. And we don't see that. Those calves are unable to actually ingest starter before they're 3 or 4 weeks of age. They just can't. They don't have the physiology and the room and makeup to actually do this. And so our argument is in this first 4 weeks of life, because they can't digest starter properly, let's just feed them lots of milk. At about 4 weeks of age, which is what Kahn did, is he started reducing the amount of milk. Look what happened to starter intake. And they maintained that advantage from day 52 to day 90 when they were all off milk. How much milk? This is a study done by Katarina Rosenberger where we looked at 6, 8, 10, or 12 liters of milk. And of course, you feed more milk and they will drink more milk. So milk intake on the y-axis, experimental day on the x-axis. One is, and really the take home, one of the challenges we have with feeding calves more milk is getting them off milk. Because remember, in nature, they would have access to milk till they were 6, 7, or 8 months of age. And we're taking milk away at 42, 50, 60, 70 days max. And so getting them off milk is always going to be a challenge. And that's one of the biggest areas that we see, having where you have to pay really careful attention. You can't do anything abruptly because those calves, so here the blue line are calves that are 6 liters, they were dropped down at about day 34. And this is the number of times they went to the milk feeder looking for milk, and it just spiked, indication that they're hungry. Those calves that were dropped down, that had higher volumes of milk, we still see this response, but it's not nearly as dramatic as those calves that are 6 liters. So we would, as I understand we have to balance economics, but what I recommend on a Holstein calf to feed at least 8 liters in the first 4 weeks of life. Then you can slowly bring it down and feed them however long the farmer wants to feed them. And then again, over the course of a week, you take them down to, you wean them completely off milk. Because every time you change the milk, you're going to get a response, as you did here at weaning at about day 48. What we do know is that there's growing evidence that pre-weaning weight gains predict future productivity. There's been a series of studies that have done that those calves that are fed these higher planes of nutrition via milk feeding in the first 4 weeks produce more milk in the first lactation. And there is some carryover effect into subsequent lactations. I always say to farmers, she's going to pay it back. She's going to pay you back down the road in milk if you feed her according to her needs, her real needs, when she's a neonate. So the conclusions here is that we need to feed calves more milk via nipple and don't wean abruptly. I didn't talk about this, but what we also know is these calves want to become ruminants. And it's for this reason, and they want to become ruminants, but they're born as a monogastric. So they need some time to get used to eating starter. We also know that in subsequent work that Kahn did is if you're feeding high levels of milk, they will, and you start taking that milk down, they will eat starter, but they also will want hay. They have an innate desire for forage. And what we've shown is when these calves are fed high planes of nutrition is that they don't eat the forage for volume or nutrition. They start to pick at it a little bit. And I think it's really important to I think they use this as that scratch factor to become a ruminant. But you can't think about forage unless you're feeding at least 8 liters a day. So I want to go on, when you're working with farms and if they're limit feeding and individual housing, you got to tackle these things one at a time. The first thing to tackle is individual housing. Is how you feed those calves. You can't really have a successful transition to social housing until you're feeding calves more milk, and it is via a nipple. Nipple feeding is really important. The other thing, just from a practical standpoint, one of the most common mistakes that we see on farms that are nipple feeding lots of milk, and they still have problems with cross-sucking, is that the nipples are super old, they're really big, and these calves, again, they're highly motivated to suck. So make sure that nipple is super clean it often, but it also that the hole is really small. Because what you want them to work really hard. You want the saliva to be coming down, and that will help with buffering in the rumen, all of that kind of stuff. So Andrea, as part of her PhD, she did this study where we were had this feeding regime. We're feeding lots of milk via nipples, slowly stepping them down at about 4 weeks of age, and then doing a slow transition to weaning at about day 52. So she decided to look at social housing. And the simplest form of social housing are two calves. One, and so she compared individual housing versus two calves. And what you can see here is we had these individual housing and we sort of where these two bars are on the left side of the picture. Originally there was a white wall in there. So all she did was take out every second white wall, or actually every third. So she had an individual, a pair, individual, a pair, individual, pair. And the pairs were just, they had per calf the same amount of space. They each had a bottle. They all had, everything was duplicated. The only difference was is that they could be friends. When she looked at starter intake, the pair house calves consumed more starter during the milk feeding period. Everything was exactly the same. And would think what's happening here is the starter intake on the x-axis and the grams per day is that those individual calves were eating a little bit of starter. But the pair house calves, I think what happened there is a calf in the pair went to eat the grain. And then his buddy looked at him and said, "Oh, I wonder what he's doing," and mimicked that behavior. And we call that social facilitation. And so, and we've shown this again and again, and we've also done on-farm studies. When you look at grain intake and pair house calves, they consume more starter during the milk feeding period. And we really do believe it's because they're mimicking their partner, this social facilitation. She also, what she did is because she had these individual pair, is that she would wean these calves, start the weaning process for a single and a pair together. And of course, because this study went over months in order to get, I think we had 8 or 10 replicates per treatment. But again, the idea here was to wean a single and a pair at the same time. And here what she looked at was weaning distress. They're in the same barn. The pair house calves are together. The single house calves, they have walls between their calves, but they can actually see other calves across the alley because there was a laneway and there was more single and pair on the other side. So they could see other calves. They just couldn't touch another calf. And what you see here in terms of vocalizations is that those single house calves vocalized almost 2.5 times as much as the pair house calves. And here, what I say is, I think if you're going to go through a stressful event in your life, it's way better to go through that event with a friend than by yourself. What she then did is she took those individual and pair house calves, she kept them in that environment for an additional week in their home, in those first pens. They were all eating starter out of the bucket, seemed to have calmed down, everything was fine. So about 7 to 8 days after weaning had been completed, she moved them, a pair and an individual calf, into this group house pen. And in that group house pen were 3 calves that already knew how to use the grain feeder. And the first thing she did is she looked at latency to start feeding out of the grain feeder. Now remember, they'd only ever had grain out of a bucket. They had never been in a situation where they had to walk into this race to gain access. That said, there was 3 calves that knew how to do that. And she looked at latency to the first meal. And we've never redone this experiment for ethics reasons because we were just shocked at the results. Those calves that had been previously individually housed took almost 50 hours to have their first grain meal, whereas those pair house calves only took 9 hours. And Andrea said it was like the individual house calves were like yo-yos, were jumping all over the pen. She then followed those calves over the next 2 weeks. So this is solid feed intake, kilograms per day, sort of a grain intake, and this is days after being introduced into that group pen. Those calves that had been individually housed Like I said, they didn't eat for 2 days. And then they ate tons and tons. And then they stopped eating a little bit. And then they ate tons and tons. And then they stopped eating a little bit. And then it took them almost 2 weeks before they really got up to the pair house calves. The pair house calves really never missed a beat. They took them, like I said, about 9 hours. They said, oh, this is what I got to do, and went on their merry way. Not surprising, given the fluctuations in grain intake in the individual, we saw some pretty crazy yo-yoing on the weight gain. So the red dotted line are those calves that are individually housed. This is their weight gain. And we see, because they didn't eat for 2 days, that they lost almost 2.5 kilos during that time of weight gain. And we worked really hard to have that 2.5 kilos put on during the milk feeding, and it's just gone. They then gained weight, but because they stopped eating grain, they lost weight. And I think what's happening here is rumen acidosis, although we didn't test for it. But what does a ruminant do if it's got a tummy ache? It stops eating. And in this case, once they stopped eating, the rumen pH came up, they got hungry, they ate too much grain, rumen pH fell again, they stopped eating, they lost weight. And again, you still see this yo-yoing is still continuing on for 2 weeks. The other thing she then did is she took these individually and pair house calves. She ran a whole nother set of calves, and she put them into an arena. And this is the black calf is a pair house calf. The black and white calf or the one with more black and white, is an individually housed calves. These calves have never met each other. And this is the very first time that this individually housed calf has been in any social contact. And what we see is that this individually housed calf is socially, I would say, awkward. It doesn't know what it's doing. It is completely focused on that other calf. It took, and she looked at latencies to touch the other calf. These individually housed calves took much longer to make social contact. But then once they made social contact, the only thing they did was sniff that other calf. In contrast, that black calf, I think if they could talk and I could test them and ask both calves, please describe the environment that you were just in, I think the black calf could give me a description. The individually housed calf can't. This is in contrast to two calves that were both socially reared, had never met each other. It's a really boring video because they go in there, they sniff each other, and then all they do is they walk around and they explore their environment together. Super calm, no running. Everything is just totally calm. We argue in the paper this is likely the explanation for why those calves were able to reduce the latency to their first grain meal in the previous experiment. It's because they were calm, they watched the other calves, and they followed suit. Whereas the individually housed calves were like yo-yos, bouncing around and only focused on the other calves and never even likely saw the feeder. We also know that how we house them can affect their cognitive development. And we know from previous work done in the psychology literature, and this is Harry Harlow's work, that where they looked at non-human primates and they had these babies that were individually reared with a puppet, and this is in the 60s, you'd never get ethics approval for this now, versus another group where the little ones were with their mothers. They were in a complicated group, complex group with lots of other mothers and lots of other babies and lots of things that they could play with. And they held them like that for a year. And then they looked at cognitive rigidity, behavioral flexibility, and neophobia. And of course, these individually ones just failed miserably in all of this compared to their socially reared counterparts. Well, we decided to look at calves, because in essence, this is what we were doing, is that we were housing them individually in the absence of any maternal or any sort of social contact. And so we reared these calves individually, or I should say, Becky Mahar and a bunch of other very hardworking students reared these calves, half of them individually and half of them in pair housing. Well, actually, this first group, what we did is we mimicked the exact study that the Harry Harley did. First group were individually, and then we had these calves that were with their mothers. The mothers actually had bras on, but they were in this complex group with lots of cows and other calves. And then and they had access to ad libitum milk. Everybody was fed lots of milk in this study. And so and then they were taken out every day and they were trained. And they were trained to do a test. And they went into an arena, and I'll show you a video in a second, where at the back of the pen was a screen. Half the calves were taught that there was a start box, a signal was given, and calves love to play the game. That for half the calves, if the screen turned red, they had to run back, touch the screen, and then they could get some milk. And this kept repeating. Those calves where red was positive, if the screen turned white, they weren't supposed to go. But if they went, they got a timeout and they had to wait for the game to restart. And they hated that. So we did all that. And like I said, half the calves were individually and half were in this complex social environment. And this is the video. There's a start box. This calf red is positive. They got a small, I think about 50 or 100 mils of milk, and then the game started again. So white was no go. And you learned that. So this is the discrimination, the learning. It didn't matter how you grew up, whether or not it was individual or in the group complex social housing system. And this is the correct no-go responses. So in particular example, how many times were they right when it turned white for that calf? Did he not go? So he was correct in not going, or she was correct in not going. And then this is the number of sessions. I should say that this is not days. We did 2 sessions a day, or the students did 2 sessions a day. So 1 would be the morning, 2 the afternoon, 3 and 4 would be day 2. So this is actually 7 days of data. It didn't matter. You learned how to play this game, irrespective of how you grew up in terms of the housing system. But what we did is, or Becky and students did, is they changed the rules. Those calves that were positive for red now got a timeout if it turned red. They would only get milk when it was the white. So, and again, half the calves were also the other color. So they had to switch, what's called a reversal learning task. And then what we did is we had these correct no-go responses, and this is the reversal learning. So those socially housed calves took a day and a half, and it was like this, oh, you want me to do the opposite? And they went along their way and did this. Individually housed calves, they just didn't get it. And this was 7 days. I should tell you that the students actually, the study actually ended. They actually trained those individually housed calves for an additional 7 days in the hope that they would learn, and they saw no response. So what this is very similar to what the non-human primate work that Harry Harlow did, was this cognitive rigidity. They couldn't change the rules. They were trained this way, and they just, to do the opposite, they kept going back to their baseline training. We did a follow-up study where we looked at also, keeping cows and calves together is not that practical yet. So what would happen if we had individually housed calves for the entire milk feeding period, pair housed calves for the entire milk feeding period? But what would happen if we took an individually housed calf, and the last 2 weeks of the milk feeding period, we would pair them. And then we again run this complex group as our sort of positive control. And so what you can see here, this is percentage of successful calves that were successful in learning the reversal. So they all learned the original game, and then when we changed the rules. And what you can see here again is that the individual again crashed and burned. Late pairing did have some advantages. It's sort of intermediate, and early pair was the same as group. So it doesn't seem to be so much the mother being there, but it's having this social partner from a very early on. And then depending on the farms that you're working with, late pairing may be a first step rather than pairing from the get-go. And you'll have to work with your farmers to see what sort of traction you get. And of course, this has to be monitored carefully because they're going to be freaking out about cross-sucking and all that kind of stuff. I have heard, and this is anecdotally, farmers that I talked to one farmer who went to social housing or pair housing from early on. And I said to him, I said, oh, I said, did you enjoy the benefits of them being less stressed, eating more? And he said, no. And I went, oh, he says, totally pragmatic. When it comes to training them for the automatic milking system, yet an AMS unit, the pair house calves are way calmer, way easier to train. And that's why I do it. I'll take whatever I can get. Okay, so that's calves. I want to switch now to lameness. This is lameness prevalence global, and I tried to highlight sort of the US data. And the long story, or the short story of this complicated graph, which is these are all freestall studies around the world. Starting in 1990 or 2000 all the way to 2020. And despite all 30 years of tons and tons of money putting into lameness research, we have not moved the needle at all. Global prevalence is 25% clinical lameness, and it's going to continue to be a struggle. We've done work on rubber. We've done all these different things about housing systems. I mean, I can tell you that, taking the neck rail away will likely reduce lameness. We've shown that. However, it means that you got to really up your game when it comes cleaning the stalls because the stalls are going to be more dirty. We have these tiny little refinements, but generally speaking, it's one of the biggest welfare issues facing the dairy industry. So and this is despite 30 years of research. So we did a study that we published in 22. This was Catherine McClellan's master's work where we took cows that were lame in a freestall system. And then and then we're all housed together. And we had 27 cows that were given, well, all of these cows were housed in the same pen. Half the cows, we had a selection gate. They could go outside on pasture whenever they wanted and come back in whenever they wanted. The other half stayed inside the freestall. And then she looked at lameness and a bunch of other things. This is the data for cows given choice to access to pasture. And what you can see is the pasture ones. And remember, we didn't push them out. They could go out whenever they wanted. And they were gate scored every week. And what you can see here is that the total week sound is, they were all defined as clinically lame in order to enter the study, 27 in each treatment group. Those cows that could go out whenever they wanted had more weeks where they were scored. This is a numerical rating score of less than 2 for 2 consecutive weeks, because that was our definition of being sound. It wasn't just sort of a one-off. And so those that had access to outdoors got better. The interesting thing is that we also know that the public really likes this. And so when we ask the public about access to pasture, of course, they 100% say that cows should have access to pasture. Having access to pasture is not something that is always practical. So we've done another series of studies with Anna-Marika Smit as her PhD, looking at outdoor access to a bedded pack. And we looked at different seasons. And again, we had the selection gate. Cows could decide when they wanted to go, where they wanted to go. And this is percent cows on the outdoor pack. This is the time of day. And in the summer night, summer when it's warm, and I mean, it's not as warm in British Columbia as in some parts of the southern US, but for our region, and we'd shown this before in other studies, even with pasture, but they make use of the outdoor pack mostly at night. During the day, they're almost always inside. They also do the majority of their eating, and they love TMR inside. I think, and we've done tons of work on freestall design. I think at the end of the day, when we look naturalistically at how cows lie down on pasture, they've got freedom of movement. They can figure out how to lie down. It is still tough to navigate to lie down in a freestall. And so I think what these cows are doing is being able to go outside and just relax during the nighttime hours. And a lot of the time spent on the outdoor pack was simply lying down. Interesting, when we looked at the same study in the winter, these cows are smart. They never went outside. Why would I go outside? There's snow on the ground. So I think we can do a lot in housing of dairy cows by just looking at giving them some more agency as to these sort of outdoor areas, exercise areas. I've seen them in California, to give them some agency of where they can lie down that is not the free stall. I want to end my talk with just once. I also do social science work, which is, or my students do, where we interview veterinarians, and we've interviewed farmers about their veterinarian and all of this. And really what comes through loud and clear from dairy farmers is that they really value veterinarians. And this is just a quote. Anytime you talk to a veterinarian about things, you sort of get motivated to do it even better. You become more conscious of it, you pick up stuff. You guys play an important role in improving the lives of dairy cattle on farms. The farmers absolutely are interested in what you have to say. One of the other things that we've shown is veterinarians are often very hesitant to talk to farmers about potential improvements if they're going to cost money. When we have that opposite conversation with the farmers, what the farmers say, I need my vet to tell me the truth, the absolute truth, even if it's going to cost me money. Because if I don't know about it, I can't make a decision. At the end of the day, of course, it's my dollar that I'm going to send. I want to spend that dollar the best way I can. But unless I have all the information, I may be making the wrong decision. So conclusions, feed calves more milk via a nipple, don't wean abruptly. Individual housing impairs cognition. Calves are fearful and increases weaning distress. Social housing in pairs or small groups provides multiple advantages. Lameness continues to be a serious animal welfare issue. Providing lame cows access to pasture can help cows recover. Veterinarians are valued and play a key role in motivating farmers to improve animal care on farms. Thank you very much.